BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Leslie, Doornfontein, South Africa, 1947. A story, like a bird of the mountain, can carry a name beyond the clouds, beyond even time itself. Willie Morm said that to me, many years ago. He has not appeared in my thoughts in a long time, but as I gaze at the mountains on this autumn morning, I can hear his thin, dry voice, his diction precise, correct. In my memory I see him again on his last night in our old house on the other side of the world. The two of us on the veranda, talking quietly. When morning came, he sailed from Penang, and I never saw him again. Half an hour earlier, as I was finishing my breakfast, a parcel arrived in the post. It had been mailed from Penang sometime in September 1946. The tangle of overlapping addresses had somehow managed to pick up my wind-blown spoor, until almost half a year after it had been posted from Penang, it had found me on this sheep farm 15 miles outside Beaufort West, South Africa. I cut the twine with my fruit knife and filleted the package open. The corner of a book appeared, The Casuarina Tree, by W. Somerset Maugham. There was nothing else in the package. No letter, no note. The table of contents listed half a dozen stories. I thumbed the pages to the last one. Murmuring its opening under my breath, I found myself instantly transported back to Malaya. I felt a heavy tropical heat smothering me, thick and steamy, and the pungent salty tang of the mudflats at low tide clogged my nostrils. I checked the title page, but there was no inscription. Printed underneath the title was the arcane-looking glyph Maugham placed in all of his books. This particular one, however, was slightly different. Some unknown hand had drawn a thin, black vertical rectangle around the symbol. Running from top to bottom was another straight black line, bisecting the frame precisely in the middle. An instant later I saw it. I understood what the lines were telling me. Robert and I had uprooted ourselves from Penang at the end of 1922, sailing on a P&O liner to Cape Town. Doctor's orders. Now in the sitting room, I walk past my watercolour paintings of old Penang shophouses to the wall of photographs. Below my wedding portrait hangs a photograph of two women, their blouses and frocks and hats quaintly old-fashioned, from another age. Ethel and me. Poor, poor Ethel. My eyes glide to the photograph next to it. I unhook and study it. Looking at the four of us, Willie Morm, and Gerald, and Robert and myself, lounging in our rattan chairs under the casuarina tree in the garden, my mind loops back to the 2 weeks in 1921 when the writer and his secretary had stayed with us at Cassowary House.
Willie, Penang, 1921. Somerset Maugham woke up choking for air. Violent coughing rocked his body until finally, blessedly, it subsided and he could breathe again. Parting the mosquito netting, he sat up on the edge of the bed and listened to the slurring of the waves on the beach. Padding barefoot across the room, he opened the shutters and leaned out. The world still lay under a grey ink wash, but at the edges of the sky a pale glow was seeping in. A wooden fence ran along the bottom of the garden, marking the property from the beach. By the fence grew a tall casuarina tree, a wrought-iron garden bench in its shade. Squinting at the beach, he made out the figure of Leslie Hamlin. She was standing at the waterline, staring out to sea. A moment later she turned around and started back towards the house, disappearing beneath the veranda roof without looking up at him. Robert and Leslie were already at the breakfast table by the time he came down, walled off from each other behind their newspapers. Willie studied them from the doorway. He remembered Robert as a handsome man, tall and bull-shouldered, so he had been dismayed by the stooped figure who had met him the previous afternoon, leaning on a walking stick and breathing in shallow gasps. "Morning, Willie. You're bright and early. Sleep well?" "Like a baby," Willie stammered. "Help yourself, Willie," Robert said, nodding his chin at the sideboard. Willie opened the lids of the chafing dishes, kippers and bacon and sausages and eggs and toast, as he had expected. He turned towards Leslie. "I saw you on the beach." "My morning walk," she said. "Your secretary, Gerald, is he up yet?" The hitch in her words was delicate, but Willie caught it. Holding her gaze, he said, "He's not an early riser. It won't cause any inconvenience, I trust." "Don't be daft, Willie," Robert replied, and added to Leslie, "Tell Cookie to set something aside for him every morning, won't you, my dear? So what's on the cards today, old chap? Leslie will be delighted to show you the sights." Leslie cut in. "I'm meeting the church bazaar ladies today." "Quiet, lazy days on the beach, that's all I want," Willie said. "I've piles of books to read, and Gerald needs rest. If you're finished with that paper, Robert." Robert passed him the Straits Times, and they finished their breakfast in comfortable silence. Leslie excused herself and went inside when Robert left for his chambers in town. After a brief tour of the garden, Willie settled on the bench under the casuarina tree with his journal. He opened a new page, uncapped his fountain pen, and printed the date on the top right corner, the 2nd of March, 1921. "Arrived in Cassowary House yesterday afternoon, still weak, but feeling much improved today." He ran his writer's eye over the house. Gerald's windows were open, a breeze pawing at their curtains. He studied the map of Penang he had copied into his journal. The island was about a third of the size of Singapore, its shape reminding him of a wildebeest's hide Siri had splayed on the floor of his sitting room. He had found it loathsome and had demanded that she get rid of it. This had inevitably sparked off another one of their rows. Willie pushed her out of his mind. The wind frisked the topmost branches of the trees. Golden orioles flitted around the garden. Willie felt the knots in his body slowly unravelling. He was looking forward to a slothful, restorative stay here with Gerald, free from all cares. Leslie had appeared on the veranda. She waved something at him. There was something wary about her, something tightly closed up. "Your mail from Singapore." She handed him a bundle of letters and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Excuse me, Willie." She beckoned to the caboon, weeding by the canis. "Bala!" The man hurried towards her. Willie listened to her giving a list of tasks to the gardener. She spoke not the hodgepodge of English and Malay that the memsahibs used when giving orders to the natives, but what sounded to his untutored ears like fluent Malay. Willie put on his reading spectacles and thumbed through his mail. He recognized a letter from his lawyers in New York and one from his wife. He frowned. Most likely Siri would be asking for more money. He turned his attention to the package. It was from his publisher, a copy of his latest book, On a Chinese Screen. Even after so many novels and short stories, he still felt a warming surge of pride every time he held his latest book in his hands. Resting it on his thigh, he picked up the letter from his lawyer. He read it once, then he read it again. He had invested £40,000, all of his money, with Tripp and Company, a brokerage firm in New York. He had hoped that he would make enough from the investment so that he would never have to write for money again. Tripp and Company had collapsed, his lawyers regretted to inform him. He had lost all his money. every penny of it. A hot, acidulous nausea flooded his stomach, searing his throat. "Are you all right, Willie? Willie?" He jerked his head up. Leslie had come back to him. "My goodness, you're white as a sheet." Her eyes darted to the letter. "Not bad news, I hope." "Just the colitis, that's all." He was mortified that he was stammering more than usual. "I haven't completely recovered from it. I'll send for Dr. Joyce. I'm all right." "Are you sure?" "I'm all right, Leslie," he said again, peevishly. To divert her attention, he showed her the book. "Oh, how marvellous," she said. "On a Chinese screen. Very evocative. A novel?" "A collection of sketches of what I saw in China." "When were you there?" 2 years ago. Did you ever—" She stopped and then began again. "Did you ever come across any mention of Dr. Sun Yat-sen?" "Just about everywhere we went. Intriguing chap. I wish I could have met him." "He passed through here about 10 years ago." "Really? What was he doing in Penang?" "Raising money for the Tongmung Hui, his party. He planned his revolution while he was staying here, you know." "Did you meet him?" "Robert and I did, yes, a few times." Willie stared at her. This was getting more interesting. "I'd like to hear more about him. I've been thinking of writing a novel about China. Sun Yat-sen would make a most unusual character." She took a step forward into the shade of the casuarina. "What was it like there?" "I've worked in the worst slums of London, but I'd never witnessed so much misery until I went to China. We saw villages lying in ruins, and thousands of peasants dead or dying from hunger and pestilence. 10 years after the revolution, 10 years after they got rid of the emperor," said Leslie. "And nothing has changed, has it?" "Nothing." The bitterness in her voice made him study her more closely. On his travels around the federated Malay states and the Straits settlements, he had never met any European, man or woman, who had shown the faintest interest in China. Instead, they had wanted to hear only about the happenings in England, the latest West End shows, the newest cafes and shops in Piccadilly. "When were you there?" he asked. "China? I've never been there." Giving him a nod, she turned around and strode across the lawn. He watched her disappear inside the house. A voice was hailing him. He looked up and saw Gerald leaning out of his windows. "Bloody gorgeous morning, eh?" Even with his hair mussed by sleep, his cheeks gaunt and unshaven, he looked magnificent, Willie thought. "Be down soon," Gerald said.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The letter had obviously rattled him. The poor man had looked positively bilious. The writer's travels had been documented in detail by the newspapers from the moment he arrived in Singapore. And a few weeks ago, Robert announced to me that he had cabled Maugham, inviting him to stay. "Is that wise?" I asked. We hadn't had any house guests since Robert came home from the war. "I haven't seen Willie in 20 years, Robert said. "It'll be marvellous." "How long is he staying?" 2 weeks. He's been ill. We shared rooms for a year. Did I ever tell you?" His eyes were shining. I had not seen him in such high spirits in ages. "I'll prepare a room for him." He's travelling with his secretary, chap by the name of Gerald Haxton. Oh, 2 rooms, then. What? Oh, yes, 2 rooms. Yes, of course. And watch what you say to Willie. There's nothing he loves more than snuffling out people's scandals and secrets. Oh, dear. And I've been thinking, Robert said, about Bernard's offer of a house and the Karoo. I'm not leaving Penang, Robert. Dr. Joyce feels that the desert air will work wonders for me. For the rest of the week I barely spoke to him. He was probably hoping that my anger would dissipate during Morm's stay. After 15 years of marriage, it wasn't hard to see right through him. The syce was dispatched to meet Somerset Maugham at the harbour on the afternoon he arrived. A thick, hot breeze was thrusting in from the sea, ripe with the smell of the tidal flats. The Humber stopped beneath the porch. A man of medium build climbed out, eyes blinking against the afternoon glare. His cream tropical jacket hung slackly on him, and his dark hair, glossed back from his brow with pomade, was beginning to grey. Robert's smile spread open almost as wide as his arms. "My dear, dear Willie, welcome to Cassowary House." I caught the flash of dismay in the writer's eyes before he masked it smoothly. "Robert, how good to see you," he said. "You haven't changed a jot." "My wife? Leslie?" Maugham shook my hand and turned to the man beside him. "Gerald Haxton, my secretary." Gerald was about 20 years younger than Maugham, a slimmer and more handsome version of the writer, with the same slicked-back hair and small, neat moustache. We had tea, and I showed them to their rooms. In the evening they joined us for drinks on the veranda, looking fresh and dapper in their white dinner jackets. Willie offered us a cigarette, but I shook my head. "I'm afraid Robert can't have people smoking anywhere near him. His lungs—" He snapped the case shut. "Terribly sorry. Of course. Utterly thoughtless of me. I breathed in something I shouldn't have in the Belgian countryside," said Robert. "You were in the war too, I believe. Red Cross ambulance driver in France. So was Gerald. That's where we met, in a makeshift hospital set up in a chateau," the younger man said, giving Maugham a sleek smile. The realization jolted me. Why had I not seen it sooner? The 2 of them were lovers. We had a pair of bloody homosexuals under our roof. I shot a look at Robert. He knew. Of course he knew. I said, "Willie, how did you and Robert first meet?" "It was at a Sunday luncheon in Edmund Goss's home. Robert and I were both young bachelors." "Wonderful times," Robert said, his eyes hazy with memory. "And you both got married," Gerald broke in. "You, Robert, to a lovely, gracious woman," a lopsided smile and a piratical wink at me. "And you, Willie, well, you married Ciri." I stole a glance at Willie. His eyes were half-lidded, his face placid. "A great shame our boys are away," Robert said. "They'd have loved to meet you. Where are they?" "Boarding school, Reading. What about you, Willie? Any sprigs from the old branch?" "A girl, Elizabeth, 6 years old and a delight." "Your wife, Ciri, does she ever travel with you?" I wondered if the poor woman knew her husband slept with men. "Ciri and I have different interests. Ciri can't live without her creature comforts." Willie and his secretary laughed. Gradually, Robert and Willie fell back into the remembered rhythms of their old friendship. The garden was receding into twilight, trailing the fragrance of flowering jasmine and frangipani. And another evening, from 10 years ago, buoyed to the surface of my memory. An evening when another traveller from a distant land had visited us, an exile from China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Wen, as he had asked us to call him. The monarchy in China was dead now, but the revolution had only pushed the antique land into a civil war. I had stopped reading about the news from there. I found it too upsetting. But ever since Robert had announced his intention to move to the other side of the world, the urge to find out what was happening to Sun Wen had begun to tug at me. A letter. I must write a letter to him. Perhaps there was still someone at the Tongmenhui headquarters in Armenian Street, someone who might be able to dig up Sun Wen's address. A rickshaw dropped me off at the gates of St. George's Church. Down Pitt Street, I squeezed my way between the fat open gunny sacks of shallots and salted fish and turned into Armenian Street. It had been years since I was last here, but the shophouses appeared unchanged. Even the people in the street seemed cloaked in an air of timelessness. I stopped at number 120. A middle-aged Chinese woman with a batik sarong wrapped around her bosom was napping in a rattan lounge chair. She jerked awake. "I'm looking for the Tongmenhui," I said in Hokkien. "What? Oh, those people, They're not here anymore, Long time already left." All this time I had been nursing the weak flicker of hope that the Tongmenhui would still have some link, however tenuous, to that house. But the Tongmenhui did not even exist anymore.
Willie, Penang, 1921. Normally, he would have instructed Gerald to do it. Instead, Willie quietly asked number 1 houseboy to go to the telegraph office and wire a message to his lawyers in New York. After breakfast with the Hamlins, he and Gerald headed down to the beach with their books and towels. Lying in the restless shade of the coconut trees, Willie tried to read, but his mind kept wandering. "For God's sake, Willie, stop fidgeting." Willie shut his book. "I'm going inside, do some work." He sat at the desk set up in his room and began reading the anecdotes he had recorded over the months of travel around the Federated Malay States, panning them for nuggets he hoped could be smelted and hammered into stories. But he couldn't stop his mind drifting to Siri and his last visit home. He had assumed that they had an unspoken understanding when he married her. She wanted a rich and famous husband and a father for her child. He needed a glamorous wife who was at home with the fashionable people of London. In the beginning it had satisfied them both, but their marriage had soured. "Like many unhappily married women I've known," Willie once remarked to a friend, "Siri had made the mistake of falling in love with her husband." Their rows grew frequent and stormy. After a particularly bitter quarrel, he told himself that the situation could not go on. That evening, after he had tucked Elizabeth into bed and read her a story, he asked Siri to join him in the sitting room. "After my book is done," he told her, "I will be going abroad. To America." Siri frowned. "You've only just got back." "Paramount's asked me to work on the screenplay for Chaplin's film." "My goodness, how thrilling. I'd love to meet him." "I'm going on my own, Siri." "I presume that secretary of yours will be there?" "It's a working trip. That's what I employ him for, and after that I'll be going to the far east with him." "I should be going with you. I'm your wife." "I'm a writer. I need to find fresh material." "You leave us on our own for months on end. I feel more like your widow than your wife." "Listen to me, Siri. If you can't accept this, then either we separate or we get a divorce." Slowly, with almost a tragic grandeur to it, her face collapsed. "You bastard!" She hurled her crystal tumbler at him. "Siri, please don't make a scene." To his relief, Siri finally stopped sobbing. "All right. You must travel. I accept that. I have tons of work to do here, thrilling ideas for the house. Willie blew out a silent breath. He was not completely free, but it would have to be sufficient. Now, less than a week after coming to Cassowary House, he was forced to resume his working routine again. Each morning he would remain at his desk, writing. Following a light lunch, he would while away the afternoon on the beach with Gerald. Despite his problems, the languorous climate was working its powers on him. Gerald's body was filling out again too, his skin varnished to a glossy teak by the sun. It wasn't long before he started frequenting the gambling dens and the brothels in the Chinese quarter, returning home in the early hours of the morning. "I'm telling you, Willie, you should come," he said one evening. "The boys here are so skillful, so eager to please." From the earliest days, Willie had made it clear to Gerald that he was free to do whatever he liked as long as he did not cause any embarrassment to Willie. He had his reputation to preserve. "Robert and Leslie aren't stupid, you know," Gerald said. "Maybe I ought to give them all the gory details." "God forbid. Even I don't want to hear all your gory details." Willie gave himself a final spruce-up in the mirror. "Our Memsahib's very curious about the devilries you get up to, have you noticed? They don't talk much to each other, those two, do they?" "There's something about Leslie," said Willie. "Something clenched up." "Just another woman in the colonies stuck in an unhappy marriage," said Gerald. "One of my poker mates told me she used to be very tight with a bunch of Chinaman rebels. Their leader, Dr. Sun. Apparently she became close to him." Gerald leered. "Very close." Willie was beginning to suspect that Leslie wasn't so conventional as she made herself out to be. "When you see your friends again, my dear boy," Willie said as they went downstairs, "find out what she got up to with this Dr. Sun. Will you?"
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Leslie, Penang, 1921. In spite of my reservations, Willie and his secretary turned out to be easy-going house guests. We hardly saw them during the day. The writer spent his mornings working, while Gerald, the employee, mind you, lazed under the coconut trees. At midday, the four of us would meet for lunch, before dispersing back to our own preoccupations. In the evenings, like animals coming together at the watering hole, we gathered on the veranda for drinks. After the fruitless visit to the Tung Men Hui's old headquarters in search of an address for Sun Wen, I had no alternative but to visit my brother at the Penang Post. "Somerset Maugham wants to write a book about Sun Wen. That'll be a tremendous coup for him," Jeff said, giving me a shrewd look. "Yes, and I wanted to write to Sun Wen and let him know. What happened to all those people at the Tung Men Hui who went to fight for his cause? Have any of them come home yet?" He shook his head. "Most of them were captured or killed. Makes one wonder if they made any difference at all, doesn't it?" "What about your friends at the newspaper? The Wonghua? They'd know how I could get in touch with him, wouldn't they? Wherever he is in China?" "Would Somerset Maugham be willing to give me an interview, do you think? You speak to your friends at the Wonghua, Jeff, and I'll make certain you get your interview." His face became serious. "Just remember, Les, we're pieces of Sun Wen's past now. I doubt very much he'll ever come back to Penang again." The cards had been flocking to Cassowary House ever since Willie arrived. Invitations for luncheons and tea, for cocktails and dinner parties. That evening he came out and spilled an armful of them onto the coffee table. "Good Lord," said Robert. "They just keep flooding in, don't they?" I fanned the invitations out across the table, and there, lying under my nose, was the means of obtaining Sun Wen's address. Say yes to this one, at least. Noel Hutton is one of our oldest friends. Everyone will be there. Everyone. You'll find lots of ideas for your stories. Willie's fingers drummed a tattoo on the armrest, his eyes never leaving my face. We'll all go. He raised his palm as Robert began to object. You'll enjoy it, Robert. We'll charm the socks off the ladies. It'll be just like the old days, eh?
Willie, Penang, 1921. Number 1 houseboy brought the cable to Willie's room around mid-morning. The message was brief and to the point. There were no legal recourses for him to recover the money from his stockbroker, his lawyers informed him. It was imperative that he return to London. He would have to mortgage his house and auction off his works of art and antiques. He slapped the cable on the desk. How the bloody hell of the situation descended to this? He could already hear Siri shrilling at him, blaming him for this catastrophe. He shuddered. A few weeks ago, he had made a decision. Once he returned to London, he would inform Siri that he would be moving out of their home. He would move to the south of Europe and buy a villa. Gerald would come and live with him. All his plans, all his dreams swept away. Most of all, he feared he would lose Gerald. After 7 years with Willie, he was accustomed to the very best in life. He would not take kindly to the news that Willie was broke. The whole of Penang's come to kowtow to you, Willie, Robert murmured into his ear as they entered Noel's party and found close to 100 people milling on the lawn. Waiters bearing trays of drinks patrolled. Servants filled plates with food on the long tables. My dearest friends, Noel proclaimed to the crowd with the gravitas of a Roman senator, our guest of honour, Mr. Somerset Maugham. Cheers and applause gusted across the lawn. Willie smiled, pressed his palm on his stomach and offered a short bow. Noel herded them down the steps, where they were immediately surrounded by the guests. At some point in the evening, Willie realised that Leslie was no longer with their little group. He scanned the crowd and saw her standing by the stone balustrade at the far end. Her attention was fixed on an elderly Chinaman, making his stiff and tentative way down a flight of granite steps. The moment the man disappeared from view, she put her champagne flute down on the balustrade and followed. There you are, Willie, Noel called from behind him. I thought you'd got lost. Arranging his face into an expression of polite interest, Willie allowed his host to reel him back into the party. He managed to slip away again when Noel was distracted, crossing the lawn and down the same granite steps he had seen Leslie taking. He soon came to a small wooden deck. Leslie was leaning against the railing. Your legion of admirers released you from their clutches? Where's Robert? With his friends. Don't worry. Gerald has strict orders to look after him. Since you're here, will you sign this? She handed him the book in her hands. It was, he saw, a copy of The Trembling of a Leaf. For that venerable Chinaman you followed down here just now. It's for his son. He left Penang many years ago to fight for Sun Yat-sen, she said. Curious, Willie thought, how the Chinaman's name kept bobbing up from her lips. He lit a cigarette for himself and gave one to her. She took the silver cigarette case from him and turned it over in her hand, stroking the red precious stones embedded in its lid. My goodness, these aren't rubies, are they? I should bloody well hope so. It used to belong to James Brooke. Now there's one man you should write about, the Rajah Brooke and his whole mad family. It wouldn't make for an interesting story. James Brooke? He founded the only European royal family in the East. Why, his life must have been chock full of adventures and escapades. It was an eventful life, but there's no love interest, and a story without love just wouldn't work. He never married, did he? A sly, knowing smile curled her lips. and I've never heard any mention of a woman in his life." Willie was silent. "Perhaps he had loved someone, but he couldn't tell anyone about it," she said. "To love and to be loved, and yet not to be able to let anyone know about it. And every trace of that love obliterated when you're gone." Willie was struck by the pain in her eyes. "No one would ever know it had ever existed, that it had given you great joy. Perhaps the only joy you'd ever experienced in your life." Her melancholy mood affected him. Would anyone ever know how much Gerald meant to him? Did it matter? In silence they watched the sun slip away. Two people bearing witness to the last light of the day depleting from the sky, from the world.
Leslie, Penang, 1921. I shifted in my bed, staring into the shadows above me. Sleep was far away. I got up and went over to the windows. Before Willie tracked me down at Noel's party, I had followed Mr. Lowe down the stairs to a wooden deck. Sensing my presence, he half turned from the view and gave me a polite nod. "Good evening, Mr. Lowe," I said. "We've never met. My name's Leslie, Robert Hamlin's wife." Hamlin. I indicated the book he was holding. "You came to meet Willie Morm?" I was hoping he would sign this for me. He showed me the front cover, the trembling of a leaf. "It is for my son. Somerset Maugham is his favourite writer." "Where is your son now?" I asked. "He followed Dr. Sun Yat-sen to China a few years ago." It was so easy. I didn't even have to tack the conversation towards the direction I wanted. "What's the latest news?" "Dr. Sun? He's very sick, I was told." "What's the matter with him?" "His liver. They say he has a year, maybe 2. I refused to look away from his gaze. "He's a remarkable man." "Many people would agree." "But not you." "He stole my son, Mrs. Hamlin. I wish that man had never set foot in Penang." "But you gave money to his party, the Tong Men Hui." "Money? Money is easy to give, Mrs. Hamlin. I would give away every cent I have for my son to return to us, safe and unharmed. I would give everything I own just to know he is alive." "You haven't heard from him?" All at once he looked frail. 2 years. Nothing. Not a single letter. "Did you ask Dr. Sun?" "My contacts in China have no idea where Dr. Sun is. All they can tell me is that he's constantly moving. I must go home. My wife is very ill, but she insisted I had to get Mr. Morm to sign our book." "Give it to me." I held out my hand. "I'll get him to sign it for you." I tugged the book gently from his fingers. Back home, I slipped into my dressing gown and padded downstairs with the trembling of a leaf. A weak spill of light drew me to the sitting room. Willie was slouched in his usual armchair, reading. "Can't sleep either?" He squinted at the book in my hand. "Well, some of my critics would say you've picked the perfect soporific." The despondence in his voice seemed uncharacteristic of him. "You've been looking strained since you got here," I said. "What's troubling you?" His face closed up. "Just a bit of unwelcome news. From my lawyers. I made an unwise investment." It was obvious that he was more worried than he let on. I showed him the title page of The Trembling of a Leaf. "This strange-looking symbol you put in your books, what is it?" "It's called a Hamza. It's a Moorish sign to ward off the evil eye. Hamza. I savoured the strange word silently on my tongue, this short intake of breath followed by its long surrender into the air. The silence around us, the very weave of the night itself, felt denser. Even the waves outside, fraying away the margins of land, seemed to have stilled into stone. "Where does a story begin, Willie?" I asked. "Where does a wave on the ocean begin?" he said. "I want to tell you a story, Willie," I said. Yes, I thought to myself, tell him your story. Let him write it. Let the whole world know.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Leslie. Penang, 1910. If I were a novelist, Willie, I would tell you that 10 years ago I woke up on the morning of April the 25th with a sense of uneasiness, a feeling that my life would never be the same again. That's what a novelist would do, isn't it? But truth be told, I felt nothing of the sort. When I woke up that morning, I lay in bed, listening to the drowsy waves as the light outside changed, the ink of night diluting to dawn. On my way downstairs, I looked in on my sons in the nursery. They were still fast asleep in their cots, but my old armour, Ah Peng, was already up. Robert was at the breakfast table on the veranda, dressed for the office, his hair combed and pomaded. After 4 years of marriage, I thought he was just as handsome as the first time I laid eyes on him. "Cantley's asked me to meet his former pupil when he arrives from America," Robert said as I took my seat. "A Dr. Sun Yat-sen. A Chinaman? Worse, a revolutionary. The Chinese government has put a bounty on his head, a sizable one too. It'll be interesting to hear what this chap has to say about China." I picked up the Penang Post and was about to turn the page when a small headline caught my eye. My goodness! What's the matter? Ethel's been arrested. She killed a man. Mousy Ethel Proudlock. He tried to rape her. Good Lord! Who's the poor chap? His name... My voice stalled. His name is William Stewart. She shot him 2 nights ago. I was only half aware of Robert pulling the newspaper gently from my hands. "An inquest will be held next week to determine if she is to be charged with murder," he read aloud. Murder? But she was only protecting herself. If she's admitted to killing him, then they have to decide if she is to be charged. That's the law. The inquest is purely a formality, that's all. She'll get off with nothing heavier than a slap on the wrist. "I must go to KL, I said. My thoughts went back to the last time I had spoken to Ethel, a month ago. I recalled what she had told me that morning in Whiteaway's bustling tea-room, as I sat there, growing increasingly appalled as she talked. I had warned her that she was acting recklessly, and that there'd be terrible consequences. But this was worse than anything I could have ever imagined. Far, far worse. Later that same morning, I was coming out of the Georgetown pharmacy when I saw my brother, Jeff. "What have you heard about Ethel Proudlock?" I asked. Throughout the morning, everyone I met in town had wanted to talk about nothing else but the killing, but no one had any details. "The police and Ethel's lawyer are as tight-lipped as Freemasons," said Jeff. "William Stewart was buried this morning." "Was he a planter?" "Engineer. Not many friends." Jeff looked at me closely. "How's Robert?" Something in his voice made me wary. "He's extremely busy. He's been slogging away late every night." I stopped. "Oh, what is it, Jeff?" "He's having an affair." For a second or two his words made no sense to me. Then the shock hit me. "For heaven's sake! How do you know?" "I saw him. I saw them." "Who is she?" Before he could answer, I gripped his wrist. "No, don't tell me. It doesn't really matter, does it? Just some bored and unhappy wife, I suppose. No shortage of them here. Is this why you've been avoiding me?" He looked relieved to be freed from the burden of his secret. "I didn't know how to tell you." "Who else knows?" "I haven't heard anything, not a whisper." "So what are you going to do?" I turned away. "Oh, for God's sake, Jeff, I've only just found out. I don't know. What would you have me do, shoot him?" "Confront him?" "What if he says it's true? And it leads to a divorce? There'd be a terrible scandal." "It'll blow over." "It would never be forgotten. Never. No, I can't do that to my boys. I can't." I had to get away. I raised my arm and flagged down a rickshaw. Thank God the first one stopped immediately. I lowered the canvas screen, hiding my face beneath it, and then allowed my dammed-up tears to spill down my cheeks. Divorcing him would be supremely satisfying, but I had seen how divorce diminishes a woman. I would be pitied at first, tolerated, but eventually I would be shunted out of the world I had married into. Other women would avoid me, fearful that I would steal their husbands. I would be forced to relinquish my position as my son's mother, and then one day another woman would slip in and replace me. Oh yes, I knew what would happen to me if I divorced Robert. That evening, when Robert came home, he found me lounging on the rattan sofa on the veranda, pretending to be engrossed in a book. We chatted idly about our day before we went upstairs to bathe and change for the Picketts' party. It was just another evening in the life we had made together. The ballroom of the Eastern and Oriental Hotel was packed with the Picketts' guests. I nursed my glass of wine and eyed the women around me. A Chinaman approached Robert. He was in his late 20s, slim and bright-eyed. "Darling," said Robert, "my new assistant, Peter Ong." "I hope you're helping out my husband," I said. "He's working far too hard these days." "He has very exacting standards, Mrs. Hamlin." His English was beautiful, each word emerging from his lips with angular precision. "I am acquiring a great deal of knowledge from Mr. Hamlin." He made his excuses and wended his way across the ballroom. At that moment, I wanted nothing more than to go home and hold my children tightly. "Those two over there." I jerked my chin at a couple of Chinamen making directly for Robert and me. "I think they want to speak to you." The two Chinamen had stopped in front of us. "Mr. Robert Hamlin," the younger one said. "Dr. Arthur Lowe. And this gentleman here," he presented the man beside him, "is Dr. Sun Yat-sen." The man gave us a brief little bow. He was in his mid to late 40s, dapper in a grey suit, white shirt, and a dark blue bow tie. I thought he looked more like a diplomat, and a handsome one at that, than a revolutionary hunted by his government. Our eyes met. I held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, then looked away. "When did you arrive?" asked Robert. "I came in from Singapore this afternoon. Dr. Cantley asked me to look you up. He sends his regards." "You're taking a grave risk, aren't you?" said Robert. "This is British territory. They wouldn't dare lay a finger on me here." Dr. Sun chatted with us until Dr. Lowe touched his elbow. "Please excuse us, Mr. Hamlin. I have to give a talk at the Koo Clan House." "A political talk?" Robert asked with feigned innocence. "I'm sure you are well aware that I would be deported immediately if I did anything of the sort here. No, my talk is on Chinese literature and history. Come for drinks tomorrow. You too, Dr. Lowe. We're at Cassowary House, Northern Road. Shall we say 5:30? The Chinaman revolutionary showed up at our home at precisely 5:30 the following evening. "Dr. Lowe sends his regrets," Dr. Sun said. "His daughter is not feeling well." "Your English is faultless, Dr. Sun," Robert said. "Where did you study?" He asked us to call him Sun Wen. He was born in a small village in southern China, and at the age of 12 he was sent to live in Honolulu. For 5 years he stayed there until he returned to China. Having seen the world, I was appalled by my own country. I found my village backward, our people shackled by their superstitious beliefs, Sun Wen said. I caused some problems at home. So my parents sent me to Hong Kong to further my studies of Christianity. "You're a Christian?" Robert asked. "I do not belong to the Christianity of the churches. I belong to the Christianity of Jesus, who was a revolutionary himself. The revolution is not mine alone. It belongs to all Chinese people. We are going to establish a republic where everyone is equal, where everyone is free, men and women." Sun Wen talked of the corruption of the emperor, and of how his people were enslaved to the Manchus. "The Manchus are not Chinese," he told them gravely. Dusk rouged the sky. Inside the house, the servants were going around lighting the lamps. Ah Peng brought our boys, James and Edward, out to the veranda. They were fragrant from their evening bath. I caught a glimpse of pain in the Chinaman's eyes. "You have children, Sun Wen?" "I have a son and 2 daughters. They are with my wife in Hong Kong." "It must be hard on your wife, all this travelling around the world." "They accept it." "They?" I asked. "Both of my wives." "I'd have thought," I said, "that you of all people would be against something so backward." "My first marriage was arranged for me when I was a young man, Leslie. The second one was of my own choosing." "A prettier and younger woman, no doubt," I said. "I've yet to meet a man who'd choose differently," Robert laughed, slapping his knee. "I don't find that funny at all, Robert." I turned back to Sun Wen. "All night long you've been talking about equality. Let me ask you this. After you've established your republic, will you allow us women to take as many husbands as we like? Younger and handsomer, more virile ones? It's only fair, isn't it? It's only equal. What you are demanding, Leslie, it goes against the natural order of heaven," said Sun Wen. "So does rebelling against your emperor." The anger I'd been holding in check was threatening to spill out of me. I felt lightheaded, reckless. "Your talk of equality means nothing," I went on. "We women have to tolerate our husbands marrying another woman, tolerate you rutting with anyone you like." "You're ranting, Leslie," Robert broke in. Sun Wen dug into his pocket and drew out his watch again. "I must go," he said. "I'm expected at the Chinese Chamber of Commerce." Robert showed him out of the house. I left the veranda and went into the garden. Twilight was roosting in the trees. "I'm going to KL tomorrow to see Ethel," I told him. "I'd like to attend the inquest." "All right, fine, if that's what you want." I turned back to look at the sea again. On the far side of the channel, the mountains had already dissolved into night.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Leslie, Penang, 1910. Tongkangs and sampans were moored 4-5 vessels deep. Seabirds dipped and wheeled above the swamp of riggings and swaying masts. I held on to the gunwales as the ferry churned its way across the busy channel to Butterworth. The train steamed out of the station punctually, and when we drew into KL, the sun had dropped behind the Moorish domes of the railway station. I took a rickshaw to the hotel, then on to Ethel's bungalow. A heavy late afternoon stupor lay over the house. Ethel entered.
"Oh, Ethel, what an awful, awful thing for you."
We sat down across from each other.
"Where's Will?"
A vague, distracted air hovered about her.
"Still in his office, I suppose."
"Strange, isn't it? The man who attacked me has the same name as my husband." What an odd thing to remark upon, I thought, sweeping my eyes over her.
"Are you coping? Will's been an absolute pillar, but, I just wish the whole deuce thing were over and done with.
It'll all blow over in no time.
They're saying that I was sleeping with Stewart." "Was William Stewart the man—"
I faltered.
"Was he—"
The last time we had seen each other, in the tea-room of Whiteaways, Ethel had confided that she was having a mild flirtation with a man. Those were the very words she used. A mild flirtation. She did not tell me his name, and I did not ask. I was appalled.
"Who else do you think it was?"
Ethel snapped at me now, her eyes narrowing.
"You think I sleep with every man I meet? Is that what you think of me? Oh, don't be silly, Ethel. You didn't blab to anyone, did you? You didn't tell Robert?"
"I promised you I wouldn't, didn't I?" I reached across the coffee table and took her hand. "Why did William Stewart visit you that night? Did you invite him?"
"Of course not. I had told him that it was over between us, but he couldn't accept it. The miserable wretch was utterly besotted with me. He came to beg me to change my mind. But when I still refused, he flew into a rage and attacked me. Oh, Leslie, I have never been so terrified in my life."
"What will you tell the inquest tomorrow?"
"I don't have to tell them anything, Leslie."
She was right, of course. The inquest was purely a formality, to determine if there was a need to hold a full trial for murder. Ethel would not be required to present her side of the story in tomorrow's proceedings.
"I'm awfully tired, Leslie."
"Of course. I must go." Ethel rang the brass bell by her side. When I left, she was still sitting there in her chair, staring out at the veranda, a void behind her eyes. At 8:45 the next morning, Ethel, flanked by her husband William and her lawyer, entered the courtroom. The murmurings in the public galleries ceased. She looked stylish, in a pale blue dress with a narrow collar and fitted sleeves. I marvelled that she had found the time to have her hair done. Paul Hereford, the deputy public prosecutor, began. "On the night of the 23rd of April, Sunday, William Stewart was dining with 2 friends when he excused himself and left for the Proudlocks' bungalow." Only the accused and the cook were at home that night, we were told. Ethel's husband William was dining with his friend. When William Stewart arrived, he told his rickshaw coolie to wait. Stewart then walked the rest of the way to the bungalow. About 10 minutes later, the coolie heard 2 or 3 gunshots. Moments later, he saw Stewart staggering down from the veranda, pursued closely by a European mem with a gun. Frightened, he ran back to his rickshaw and sped away, hearing 3 more shots being fired. The rickshaw coolie, Tan Eng, identified Ethel Proudlock as the woman he had seen pursuing the deceased, said Hereford. Mrs. Proudlock, the accused, does not dispute that she killed the deceased. However, she claims that she had killed him in self-defence. Self-defence. Ethel Proudlock shot William Stewart 6
times. 1 shot went into his chest, another shot went into the back of his neck, and 4 shots into his head. Gasps and shocked whispers filled the gallery. I was stunned. 6 times. Inspector Wyatt discovered the deceased's body lying on the grass and, on examination, found his clothing to be entirely intact. He was still wearing his mackintosh, and his trousers were buttoned up. Mrs. Proudlock claims that she was dining alone at home, Hereford continued. Yet she was attired in a tea-gown that was cut very low. Why was she dressed to entertain, unless she was expecting a caller? It was entirely probable, I wanted to shout. Ethel adored wearing beautiful clothes. And what is more, the signs of struggle on the veranda were minimal. Your Worship, said Hereford, we are here today to determine if Mrs. Ethel Proudlock is to be charged with murder. After further witnesses, Magistrate Daly finally ordered Ethel to stand. A slap on the wrist, I repeated to myself. She'll go home today. After listening to the facts of the case, he said, I have decided to refer the matter to trial. Shouts and cries erupted from the gallery. I sat there, trembling with shock. My best friend had just been charged with murder. Murder! The magistrate ordered Ethel to be taken immediately to Pudo jail.
Willie, Penang, 1921. For the entire time, as Leslie undammed the flood from within her, Willie had not said a single word. She had only stopped talking when they heard the car rattling up the driveway. Willie wished fervently that Gerald had stayed out at his debaucheries until dawn. He wasn't at all surprised by Robert's affair, but he suspected that Robert's infidelity was not the sole cause of the sorrow buried inside Leslie. Something else, something much more painful, had happened to her. After breakfast, he wrote down in his journal everything she had told him. He had struck his first seam of gold. A thin seam, but it was promising, and he intended to quarry the rest of it from the depths of her memories. He changed into his bathing shorts and a cotton shirt, jammed his Panama hat on his head, and strolled down to the beach. "This is an unexpected visit," Gerald said. Willie took Gerald's hand in his, brought it to his lips, and kissed each knuckle. Stammering more than usual, he began to tell Gerald about the money he had lost. Gerald sat up and gaped at Willie. "You're bloody joking." "I never joke about money." "You've lost everything." "I'll need to speak to my manager when I get back to London and find out how brutal the damage is, but yes. Christ! No more first-class cabins, no more luxury hotels. In fact, no travelling at all for a while." He took Gerald's hand again. "I want us to be together for as long as we can." "What about my salary?" "I'll have to survive on your army pension for a while, my boy." "But it's a pittance." "Damn it all, Gerald, I'm aware of that, but we have to tighten our belts." "What a bloody disaster!" Gerald gave a sidelong squint at Willie. "How did your darling wife take it?" "You're the only one I've told." "Perhaps she'll divorce you now that you're a pauper." The possibility of Ciri leaving him had not occurred to Willie. He didn't know whether to be overjoyed or dismayed by the prospect. Gerald walked between the pools of marooned water, turned to mercury by the sun. The egrets flew off. Gerald kept walking, heading towards the thin white strip of surf in the distance, until he was nothing more than a small wavering mirage. In the autumn of 1913, Willie began his affair with Ciri Welcome, recently separated from her husband, Henry, the pharmaceutical tycoon. She was a famous hostess among London's fashionable set. She was fun and stylish. He saw it as nothing more than a fling for both of them. So Willie was horrified when one day she told him she wanted to have his child. He talked her out of it and considered the matter closed. He was almost glad when war broke out in Europe. He applied to the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. On the afternoon before his departure, Siri informed him that she was with child. His child. Willie sat in her expensively decorated sitting room, tight-lipped with rage. Deceitful bloody bitch. But most of all, he was furious at his own stupidity. The next morning he left England on the first boat and, with an immense feeling of freedom and relief, rushed headlong towards war. His ambulance unit was assigned to a makeshift hospital set up in a chateau 15 miles outside Boulogne. One night, trudging up the grand marble staircase to his quarters, he was overcome by a powerful longing to gaze at the stars, to look at something pristine, something unpolluted by the war. He slipped into the drawing room on the first floor and out onto the broad balcony. The bracing purity of the cold night air felt wonderful. He had wanted to be alone, so he was peeved to discover someone else already there. One of the volunteers in the Red Cross who had helped him restrain a ranting, badly injured patient earlier that day. "Gerald Haxton," the man said, "and I know who you are." His teeth flashed in the darkness. "Knew the second I clapped eyes on you. I forgot to thank you for this morning. It was bloody chaos, wasn't it, that poor bastard?" They stood shoulder to shoulder at the balustrade, their breaths flowering the hard, frosty air. They started talking, stumpy, tentative sentences, testing the ground between them. Gradually, they drifted away from the war and began telling each other about what they would do once the madness was over. "I want to travel, see more of the world. Polynesia, the Far East, the Malay archipelago," said Willie. "And you? What do you want?" He would always remember the natural ease of the young man's reply. "From you? Or from life?" He felt his face flushing, and he was grateful for the darkness. Why not both? They might turn out to be the same in the end. The silence seemed to seep out from deep inside the earth and rise all the way to the stars above. And then, in the darkness, he heard Gerald Haxton saying, "I've got a bottle of gin in my room." And it was as simple as that.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Leslie, Penang, 1910. One of Sun Wen's supporters had lent him a bungalow not far from our house. He became a regular visitor, always staying long enough for just one drink. He had people to address, he would announce, at the Philomatic Union on Armenian Street, the Reading Club. "Reading Club, my foot," Robert remarked one evening after he'd just left. "It's nothing more than a front for his party." As I had expected, it didn't take long for my brother Jeff to catch wind of our friendship with Sun Wen. At his request, I arranged for Jeff to meet him at our house one rainy evening. "Things all right?" my brother asked when he stepped into the vestibule. "I'm fine. Robert's working late," I said, and I couldn't refrain from adding acidly, "He sent his peon to tell me at the last minute." "You haven't talked to him about—" "Good Lord, no. Maybe it's better you don't. I shouldn't have told you." Not for the first time, I wondered if he had been mistaken about Robert. For weeks I had been waiting for some well-meaning mem to draw me aside and with barely concealed glee whisper into my ear the gossip about my husband's infidelity. But nobody said anything. Not a single person. After one drink, Sun Wen looked at his watch as usual. "I must go. I'm speaking at the reading club." "The Philematic Society in Armenian Street?" Jeff got to his feet. "I'd like to tag along." "I'm coming too," I said. "Ah Peng will put the boys to bed." We followed Sun Wen's rickshaw down dark, quiet streets, hemmed in by two-storied shop-houses. Blackwood signboards perched above door lintels, their carved, gold-leafed Chinese calligraphy glowing in the shadows like candle flame glimpsed through clouds of smoke. In the hall of the shop-house were 30 or 40 people, women as well as men. They were in their 20s and 30s, many of them in Western clothing. Everyone fell silent as they became aware of us. Sun Wen introduced us, then added to me, "Ah, here comes Arthur. He will interpret for you." He smiled at me, and as Sun Wen began to speak, Arthur whispered to us, but he soon struggled to keep up with his torrent of words. But Sun Wen's fury needed no interpreter. I was swept up by his passion, by his towering, implacable conviction. During his next visit to our home, Sun Wen mentioned that he was translating the Tung Mung Hui's pamphlets and articles into English so they could be disseminated among the Straits Chinese. Arthur checks the translations, but he can't really spare us the time. "I can look over them for you," I said. "You're not going there, Leslie," Robert said. "I forbid it." Sun Wen's smile withered away. "Ah, yes, of course. Your wife should not be seen in the company of us Chinamen. You know quite well that the rest of Penang isn't as accepting as we are." I felt awful for Sun Wen. How often did he have to swallow his pride for the sake of his cause? I said to Robert, "I can collect the papers tomorrow morning. I'll do the work at home." "It's very kind of you, Leslie, but—" Sun Wen shook his head. "Tomorrow morning," I repeated firmly. Sun Wen got to his feet and gave us a clipped bow. "Thank you, Robert and Leslie, for welcoming me into your home." I rounded on Robert after he left. "Write him a note and apologize." "I'll do nothing of the sort." "What he's trying to achieve will end the suffering of millions of people, Robert. Millions. We have to help him." "You find him attractive, don't you?" "He has attractive qualities, yes. But I'm not attracted to him." "A perfectly lawyerly answer." I stared at him. Robert, of all people, accusing me of having feelings for another man. Enough. "Are you having an affair, Robert?" He froze. "Am I what?" Time stopped. A roaring noise flooded my head. "Are you sleeping with another woman?" "Where the hell did you get this lunatic idea from?" "Somebody saw you with another woman." He stared at me, and then he started to laugh. The sound of it was horrible, harsh and frightening. "And who's this woman, this seductive siren?" "They didn't say." "Of course they didn't." He took a couple of long, lazy draws on his pipe and looked directly into my eyes. "I am not sleeping with another woman, Leslie." Standing outside the house on Armenian Street, I studied the black signboard above the doors. I knocked. A minute later, a bolt was pulled back. "Dr. Lowe," I said, relieved to see a face I recognized. "Come along," he said, "and call me Arthur." In the dining hall, 6 people were seated around the long rosewood table, books and sheets of paper spread out before them. Arthur handed me a bundle of papers. The printers need them by noon tomorrow. Why not stay and work here? I looked at the documents and then back at him. I'll need a pen and writing paper. We chatted during a break for tea. Arthur was 30 years old, a GP. When I finished editing the last article, I handed the bundle back to him. He checked a few of them, then put them aside. "Can you come again next week?" he asked. By now, Ethel had been locked up in Pudo jail for a month. Like everyone I knew, Arthur was intrigued by her case. "Your prurient interest is unbecoming," I scolded him on one occasion. "It's not prurient. No European woman in Malaya has ever been on trial for murder," he said, as we sat around the table on one of my regular Tuesday mornings. "Ethel Proudlock's the very first. And she didn't just kill any man, Leslie. She killed someone of her own exalted race. You Angmos have always taken pride in telling us natives that everyone is equal before the law, white or brown, black or yellow. She'll be judged fairly, like you and me, like every one of us." "Oh, of course she will. The judge will put on a show of impartiality and fairness. But in the end, the verdict will be not guilty." "That's because she's not." Realization pulled up his eyebrows. "You know her?" "She's my closest friend." "Well, even if they find her guilty, they'll fashion some loophole for her to slip out of the noose. They'd never hang a white woman. Never." He was wrong, I thought, but I held my tongue as Arthur began packing up. "Patient's appointment. My doors are being delivered. Would you like to see them? I know what doors look like. Come on. It's just down the road." It was not yet mid-morning, but the sun was ferocious, and I was grateful for my parasol as we followed Armenian Street towards the harbour. Arthur stopped at the last shop-house. He held out his hand to me. I took it and stepped over the shin-high threshold. It was cool inside, the leaded windows casting a milky light into the guest hall. The house was bare of furniture. The walls, however, were hung with wooden doors painted with birds and flowers or mist-covered mountains. I saved them from shop-houses and temples that were about to be torn down, Arthur said. I went over to the pair closest to me. They were carved with vertical, sinuous strokes of Chinese calligraphy, papered in gold leaf. "Come." I followed him into the dining hall. It suddenly occurred to me what people might say. I was a white woman alone in another man's house, and not just any man, but a Chinaman. Goodness! The walls here were also covered with doors, and hanging from the ceiling beams were more doors, carefully spaced apart and suspended on wires so thin they seemed to be floating in the air. I had the dizzying sensation that I was walking down the corridors of a constantly shifting maze, each pair of doors opening into another passageway and another, giving me no inkling of where I would eventually emerge. The reading club was having one of its rare, quiet mornings, when Sun Wen turned up with a woman. "I have long wanted you to meet Shui Fun," he said. The woman took my hands in hers and thanked me for helping their cause. "She's one of his wives, isn't she?" I whispered to Arthur the moment they left. "They're not married, actually." "Oh, so she's his concubine?" "You'd better not let her hear you. She's handy with a gun. Shui Fun's been by his side for 20 years. As far as he's concerned, she's his wife." "Well, I feel sorry for his first wife." You can convey your sympathies to her yourself. She'll be joining them in a few days.
You mean all three of them under the same roof?
Every marriage has its own rules, Leslie. Was your marriage arranged? It was, as a matter of fact.
He raised his eyes.
Ah, Memsahib thinks it's a barbaric, native custom.
But do you love her?
Marriage is not only about love. Anna is a dutiful daughter-in-law, a devoted mother, and a good wife.
What about romantic love? Why did you marry Robert?
He's nearly twice your age. Was it romantic love?
The monsoon edged closer to the island, bringing heavy afternoon storms that flooded the streets.
One evening, Ah Peng dropped a fistful of papers and coins into my palm.
Dobiwala, find in Mr. Robert's pocket.
It was Friday, and Robert had taken his assistant Peter Ong to KL that morning. They would spend the weekend there, preparing for a trial. I smoothed out the crumpled receipts. Among them was a neatly folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. The words were written in a wine-red ink. My darling Robert, I love the book. Thank you. Peter.
Impudent, addressing his superior like that, I thought, as I read the note again. My darling Robert.
The realization coalesced slowly, and then, like a coffin slotting into a grave, everything fell into place. Peter.
What a fool I had been! What an utter fool!
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Leslie, Penang, 1910. I would never know how I survived the rest of that evening, how I didn't turn into a raving lunatic just thinking about Robert's affair with Peter Ong. And yet I must have slept soundly, because the next morning I woke up filled with a sense of clarity I had not felt in many years. I knew what I had to do. After I had fed my sons and handed them over to Ah Peng, I asked the houseboys to bring out my camphor-wood chest. Lifting out the layers of old clothes and sheets, I found the kabaya. The Nyonya kabaya is a long-sleeved blouse worn over a camisole and matched with a sarong. After I married Robert, I had one made by a widow in Kimberley Street who sewed for the old Straits Chinese families. "You look like a bloody native," Robert had said when he saw me in it. After having only worn it a handful of times, I had put it away. My kabaya was the shade of young bamboo. Embroidered flowers of darker green and yellow bloomed on the lapels. Ferns sprouted from the ends of the sleeves. I called Ah Peng and asked her to air it. "I'm going to a tea party for Sun Wen this afternoon."
"Wearing this?"
Yes, I've gone mad. My head is full of wind," I answered in Hokkien, shooing her out of the room. After lunch I put on the outfit. The sarong was cool and smooth against my thighs, but it also narrowed my stride, and the clothes compelled me to move with a languid grace, as befitted a nyonya with nothing to fill her days but poor cheeky card games and gossip and scolding her daughter-in-law. The road outside Arthur's townhouse on Leith Street was lined with gharries and traps. The syces squatted in the shade of the trees. I felt their eyes on me, and a crude comment or two from them singed my cheeks. Arthur was at the door welcoming his guests. His eyes widened ever so slightly when he saw me. "I changed my mind," I said. He smiled, performed an elaborate salaam, and led me into his home. There were 20 to 30 people already gathered in the guest hall, talking and laughing among themselves. I was the only Angmo there. Ah Peng was right. I was mad to wear the kabaya. I was mad to come here. I turned to leave, but Arthur stopped me. Sun Wen will be here soon, he said. And your brother's coming too. Where's your wife? I'd like to meet her. She took our daughter to my parents' house. I didn't want her disturbing us. His attention was distracted by another arrival at the front doors. Go on, I gave him a reassuring nod. From the fragments of conversations I caught around me, everyone here seemed to move in the same circles, travelling regularly to Singapore and London and Europe. Like Arthur, they spoke without the local accent. I could have been in a room full of Tuan Besars and Mems, exchanging the latest news about what they had done during their home leave. I was glad to see Jeff. He gave me a peck on the cheek and cocked an eyebrow. What's this? Dressing like a native now? I almost didn't recognise you. It does look ravishing on you, I must say. A gentleman would have said, you look ravishing in it. Well, you look different. And I don't mean the dress. You seem clearer somehow. Sharper. Robert here? KL left yesterday, I added quietly. He took his lover with him. His Chinaman lover. My brother eyed me warily. How did you find out? His catamite left him a note. A rather sweet one, actually. Jeff winced. Now that you know, your grounds for divorce have just become much stronger. Are you mad? I don't want my sons to grow up knowing that their father is... I couldn't utter the word aloud. So what are you going to do then? Stay locked up in a dead marriage for the rest of your life? Locked up? Not at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. I feel that I've been released from a prison I'd never realised I had been placed in. Strange, isn't it? Do you know how liberating it is to finally understand that it's not my fault my marriage is a failure? I wouldn't go so far as to call it a failure. Mr. and Mrs. Hamlin with their perfect marriage. No marriage is perfect, Les. His voice hardened. I detest, absolutely detest, people who are unfaithful. Yet I don't hear you objecting to Sun Wen's infidelity. He's not hiding Shui Fun from his wife, is he? And anyway, it's polygamy, not adultery. Splitting hairs. Look, Les, I don't approve of it, but there are much bigger issues at stake. There was a stirring in the hall as the guests parted for Arthur and Sun Wen. My dearest friends, Arthur announced. The man we've all come to meet, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. The revolutionary began to speak. He had a natural assurance and conviction, his words carrying us on a voyage through China's troubled history. For the sake of our beloved China, I appeal to all of you. No, I beg you, give as much as you can. Sun Wen's eyes seemed to blaze. Our comrades overseas, people like you here today, they sacrifice their money. But our comrades in China, they sacrifice their lives. A round of respectful applause broke out. How graceful you look, Leslie, Sun Wen remarked when they eventually joined us. Doesn't she look beautiful, Arthur? Did I tell you that we are going to publish our own newspaper? And what is more, a huge smile transformed his face. For the first time in 20 years, my family are together again. I'm over the moon for you, Sun Wen, I said. An approaching thunderstorm provided Arthur's friends the excuse to take their leave. Most of them walked past the pledge table without even giving it a glance. Soon Sun Wen and I were the only ones left. These people, they feel nothing for China, for her pain. All they care about is England, bloody England. I must go, Sun Wen said. He gave a short bow to me and left. I went over to the bookshelves. Quite an impressive collection of Somerset Maughams you've got here. Everything he's written. Arthur ran his fingers across the spines of the books. Sun Wen was right, you know. His voice was soft, but I could hear it clearly. Everyone here couldn't keep their eyes off you. My body felt very light, almost weightless, as I turned towards him. In the silence we looked at each other, each waiting for the other to speak, to move. "The House of Doors," I said softly. We took separate rickshaws. The streets were deserted, the wind roiling up the fallen leaves. In the low black clouds, thunder prowled like a ravenous god. Having left first, I arrived before him. I inserted the key he had given me into the lock and slipped inside. I stood there clenching my hands. This is wrong. I should not have come here. I must leave this place, now, immediately. But I did not move. I stayed there, watching the doors spinning above the tiles. The sky ripped open, and the storm roared down into the airwell, the deluge so heavy, so mighty that I could have been standing at the foot of a cataract, its spray misting my arms and face. I saw Arthur come into the dining hall. He slipped his way between the floating doors to me, appearing and disappearing as they opened and closed. And then he was before me, his hair dripping, rain plastering his shirt to his body. We did not speak. I watched his hand rise and reach past my face. He drew me towards him and kissed me on my lips. I followed him up the spiral staircase, into a room lit only by thin slits of light cutting through the shutters. In the centre of the room stood a double bed, the brass bed frame stark as the bones of a shipwreck that had come to rest on the ocean floor. In the watery half-light we undressed and reached for each other. I opened my eyes. The rain had stopped and the shadows in the corner of the room had thickened. I got out of bed and hurriedly began to dress. At the front doors I held out the key to Arthur, the long, thin key I had used to enter the house. He glanced at it, then looked at me. I opened my purse and dropped the key into it. People were already emerging from their houses, families taking their evening stroll in the street, enjoying the cool, crisp air. I flagged down a rickshaw and told the puller to take me home. In spite of my newfound knowledge about my husband, I surprised myself by greeting him calmly when he returned from KL, even pressing my customary kiss on his cheek when he stepped into the house. If Robert detected any change in me, he made no mention of it, not even obliquely. I felt irradiated by my afternoon with Arthur, as though I had fallen asleep in the sun too long, and I was certain it was visible to everyone around me. I was an adulteress now. 2 mornings a week I would go to the reading club. It was purgatory, sitting at the long table, feigning interest in my work, when I was burning to be in bed with Arthur. Around mid-morning I would leave the reading club and stroll down the street to the House of Doors. Arthur and I never arrived together, and except for our mornings at the reading club, I was inflexible that we were never to be seen together in public. No letters or written messages, no little notes that might fall into the wrong hands, I warned him. No one must ever find out about us. You're being unduly cautious, aren't you? What if something happened and I couldn't meet you? I will wait here for you. If you can't come, I'll know something's keeping you. I remembered the note I had found in Robert's pocket. No letters, Arthur. The House of Doors became my sanctuary. I went there even when I wasn't meeting Arthur, just to be by myself and, for a few hours at least, to forget everything outside its walls. Forget that I had a husband. And yes, forget even that I was a mother with 2 young sons. I brought little items to the house every time I went there. Flowers and pot plants and books. We didn't always spend our time in bed. Sometimes we would sit in the dining hall and drink tea and talk. We spoke about many things. Our childhoods, the books we were reading, China, Ethel's trial, and always Penang. He had a deep, intense love for the island, a love which I soon learned to share.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Willie, Penang, 1921. Robert felt poorly after dinner, but he refused to let Leslie summon Dr. Joyce. Willie helped him upstairs to his room and made him comfortable in his bed. "Leslie's been telling me about Ethel Proudlock," Willie said. "Ethel Proudlock," Robert murmured. "Haven't heard that name in years. The way they treated her. Her husband and her own father. They should have been hanged. And we should have said something." Willie was suddenly alert. "What are you talking about, Robert? What did they do to Ethel?" But Robert had closed his eyes and was snoring contentedly away. Willie backed out of the room quietly and went downstairs to join Leslie on the veranda, his mind continuing to puzzle over Robert's words. "Do you know what he meant?" he asked Leslie. "I haven't a clue." The night was hot and humid, shrill with cicadas. "Gerald's gone into town," said Leslie. "I'd be more surprised if he had not. It doesn't upset you? He's young. Whoever he meets out there, whatever he does, he'll always come home to me in the morning." "Did you know Robert's homosexual?" Slowly he looked up. "He never gave me any indication." "Oh, come on, Willie, you two shared rooms." "It was never mentioned between us." "How does your wife feel about you and Gerald? Does she have affairs?" "I've never cared to ask." "Oh, don't look so sanctimonious. You know what? I hope she does sleep with other men who can make her feel she's desirable and desired." Willie rose to his feet. "Good night, Leslie," he said coldly, and went inside. She came upon him in the library when she was going through the house putting out the lights. Willie closed his book and indicated the space next to him. "You're the only one I've ever spoken to about this matter, Willie. For 10 years now I've said nothing to anyone about Robert's preference. It hasn't been easy." "Siri has never met Gerald," said Willie, "but she made sure he was deported from England 2 years ago. Undesirable alien. My darling wife does not lack friends in lofty perches. Why do you homosexuals do it? Why do you marry us when you'd sooner hop into bed with a man?" Willie's reply, when it came, was silted with sorrow. "What other choice do we have? No one would think it the tiniest bit out of the ordinary at all if men like you remained bachelors. After what happened to poor Oscar Wilde." He shook his head. "The world has turned against us, Leslie. You don't know what it's like to live in fear all the time, knowing that at any moment you could be exposed. Your entire life destroyed. By marrying Robert, you have kept him safe from speculation and gossip, but most of all safe from being locked up in jail. We're wives, Willie, not martyrs." He had no reply to that, and so he said, "Tell me what happened to Ethel."
Leslie, Penang, 1910. Every seat in the courtroom was taken on the opening day of Ethel's trial. A few minutes before 9 o'clock she was brought in. I was appalled by how much weight she had lost, how small she seemed. On the stroke of 9:30, Mr. Justice Sercombe Smith entered, his crimson robe endowing him with an episcopal plumpness. The prosecutor, Hastings Rhodes, opened the trial by calling William Proudlock to the witness stand. "When was the last time you saw the deceased, William Stewart, before he was shot dead by your wife?" "It was on the day before he went to our house and attacked Ethel. Saturday evening. We saw him at the Selangor Club. We chatted for a bit." "I would like to draw your mind back to the 23rd of April, a Sunday. What did you and the accused do that afternoon?" "We had our tea around 4 o'clock, William said. "Then we spent some time practising our shooting. At 5:20, I realised we had to get ready for church. We left the revolver on the veranda and walked to St. Mary's. Later we changed, and I went out to dinner at Goodman Ambler's house. Ethel dined at home." "Is this the tea gown the accused wore that evening?" "Yes, it is." The clerk presented the gown to the judge and the assessors. It was chiffon, light green with a low, round neckline. Dinner had gone on until about 9:10, we learned, when the Proudlocks' cook arrived with an urgent message from Ethel. William and Ambler caught a rickshaw in the rain. "I saw her as we were coming to the bungalow," said William Proudlock. "I ran to her. 'Blood, blood,' were the first words she said to me. Then, 'Oh, Will, I have shot a man.' I went down into the garden and found the body lying on the grass. It was William Stewart." Leaving his wife under Ambler's watchful eye, William had gone to look for Inspector Wyatt and Dr. McIntyre. "On that particular night, when you left the accused alone at home," said Rhodes, "was she expecting any visitors?" "No. Yet she was dressed in the tea gown, with a rather revealing décolletage. It is not uncommon for Ethel to change into a tea gown in the evening. My wife loves dressing up." "Mr. Proudlock," said Rhodes, "you were in Hong Kong in December last year, am I correct?" "That's correct. For a month." "Did you leave the accused on her own?" "No. I asked my friend Hugh Marks to call at the house every night." Ethel angled her face slightly, watching me from the corner of her eye. I knew she had gone out for drives with Stewart when her husband was away in Hong Kong, and she had spent nights at Stewart's house. The prosecution called Detective Inspector Charles Wyatt. The inspector confirmed that the body was lying approximately 40 paces from the front of the bungalow. "There was a great bloody wound on the back of his head," D.I. Wyatt said. "He was fully clothed. His white tunic was buttoned, as were his trousers." The next witness was Dr. McIntyre. He testified that, after checking Stewart's body on the lawn, he examined Ethel. "I found no bruises or scratches on Mrs. Proudlock." "What was her state of mind?" "She was agitated, shaking, but I had expected her to be in a more traumatized state." Excited whispers raced through the courtroom. Inspector Frederick Ferrant was called to the stand. He had been sent to search William Stewart's house the day after he was killed. "There was a chest of drawers in Mr. Stewart's bedroom full of clothes for a European woman. Outside, one of the Chinese servants was wailing loudly. She wouldn't let up, just went on and on, beating her chest." The prosecution let the inference hang like a fetid smell in the warm, still air. The next witness was one of William Stewart's friends, who affirmed that Stewart had been having relations with a Chinese woman. On the 4th day of the trial, the moment I had been dreading had arrived. Ethel's counsel, James Pooley, summoned me to testify. Under his questioning, I informed the court that, yes, I was a friend of Ethel's. Did she like to dress up in beautiful dresses? Oh, all the time. In your opinion, was there anything out of the ordinary in the fact that she was wearing a tea-gown on the night William Stewart was shot? Asked Pooley. There was nothing out of the ordinary, I said. Ethel loves clothes. Did Mrs. Proudlock ever confide in you that she was having an affair with the deceased? I looked directly at Ethel. She gazed back at me, her expression unreadable. I thought back to that morning when she had told me about her affair with Stewart. What would happen if I revealed the truth? Would I save her? Or damn her? Still keeping my eyes on her, I said, she did not confide in me that she was having an affair with William Stewart. And there is no truth to the rumours. No truth at all. Thank you, Mrs. Hamlin, Pooley said. No further questions? I waited for Rhodes to rip my testimony to shreds, to expose my lie to the world. We have no questions for Mrs. Hamlin, my lord, said the prosecutor. The listless flapping of the punka was the only sound in the courtroom as Pooley summoned Ethel to the witness stand. She told the court that she was catching up on her correspondence on the veranda when, to her surprise, William Stewart turned up. I did not want to appear rude, so I invited him to sit. They talked about books. She went to the bookshelf to get one she wanted to show him, but he stood up and blocked her way. He grabbed me and placed his arm around my waist. He pulled me in roughly and kissed me on my lips. "Let me have you," he said. I pushed him away, but then he put out the light and grabbed my arms. He pulled up my gown and Oh, it was horrible, horrible. I reached out my hand for the light switch, and my fingers touched the revolver. A sob cracked her voice. I pointed the gun at him. I fired. I fired twice. That's all I remember. I only wanted to frighten Stewart. I didn't intend to kill him. Her facade of self-control collapsed, and she started sobbing. Did you warn the deceased that you had a revolver? I knew that if he didn't let go of me, he would rape me. The deceased was found lying face down in the garden. He had 6 bullets in his body. Can you explain how this happened? I can't. I remember firing the first shot. I don't remember anything after that. Did you ever have an affair with the deceased? Certainly not. I have never had an affair with William Stewart, nor with anybody else. She gripped the railing of the witness box, and with a fierce dignity pulled back her shoulders. I would rather be convicted of murder than live out the rest of my life under the cloud of being an unfaithful wife. The following morning, Mr. Justice Sercombe Smith reviewed the evidence presented. Then he addressed the assessors. What is your verdict on the charge of murder? Guilty. Guilty. I concur, he said. The courtroom erupted. Murderess! A man behind me cried out. Again and again the bailiffs called for silence. I hereby sentence the accused, Ethel Proudlock, said Mr. Justice Smith, to hang by the neck until she be dead. Ethel's awful keening filled the courtroom.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Leslie, Penang, 1910. After the trial, whenever I went to the reading club, the people there would dart warning looks at one another and drop their voices. The atmosphere was taut with tension and paranoia, I suspected Sun Wen was cobbling the final plans together for another attempt to overthrow the emperor. It was hard to believe that 3 weeks had passed by since Ethel was sentenced to hang. Ethel's lawyers had filed an appeal the day after her fate was laid down. Her husband wrote to the Secretary of State for the colonies, requesting a royal pardon, and was informed that the appeal for leniency should be sent to the Sultan of Selangor. I went to see her. I had to. A guard led me deep into the jail, down long, chilly corridors to her cell. She was lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. "Ethel," the thick, damp walls dulled my voice. Slowly, like a heavy stone being lifted, she turned her head towards me. Eventually she pushed herself up and trudged barefoot across the grey cement floor, stopping a few inches from the bars of the cell. She seemed to have aged 20 years. "Oh, Ethel." "This place is where they keep the condemned," she said. "The guards watch me all the time. They think I'll kill myself. Be strong, Ethel. It'll soon be over. You'll be acquitted. Robert says so. Everyone says so." "I've asked Pooley to withdraw my appeal." I stared at her. "Are you mad? Why?" She began to pace up and down. "I can't stand it here, Leslie. It'll be another month before they hear my appeal. I have to get out. I've asked the Sultan to pardon me." "But, Ethel, if you withdraw your appeal, yes, the Sultan might pardon you, but you won't be exonerated of your crime. You'll remain a convicted murderer for the rest of your life." "I've already told Mr. Pooley." She returned to her bunk bed and turned her face to the wall. Robert went down to KL for an urgent meeting with his client. He took Peter Ong with him. How ironic that Robert and I each had our own Chinese lovers. We had this unusual thing in common, but we could never discuss it. "People are furious that she's putting her fate in the hands of the Sultan," Robert remarked to me on his return. "I warned her that she'd still be a convicted murderer even if the Sultan pardoned her. The implications are much more calamitous than that. Ethel Proudlock has damaged our prestige among the natives. How can we allow an Asiatic potentate to exercise the power of life and death over a European, an Englishwoman?" And Sun Wen gave a speech last week. He attacked British rule in Malaya. Openly. I'm afraid the governor has signed the orders expelling Sun Wen from Penang. He's to be put on the first ship out tomorrow. I forced down the urge to warn Arthur. No letters, no messages. There must be nothing tangible to link us. It was only a matter of time before he was asked to leave. You know that. You'll want to see him off tomorrow. He still suspected that I had been having an affair with Sun Wen. We sat there in the silence. What sustained a marriage, kept it going year upon year, I realized, were the things we left unmentioned, the truths that we longed to speak, forced back down our throats, back into the deepest, darkest chambers of our hearts. Over 100 men and women were gathered around Sun Wen and his family when I arrived at Swettenham Pier at dawn. I pushed my way through the sombre, restless crowd. Sun Wen bowed to me and pressed his palm on his heart. "For all that you've done for our revolution, Leslie, I thank you. My family thanks you. China thanks you." "Where will you go?" "England, and then onwards to America. Always onwards. My family will remain here. Come to China when we have created our republic, Leslie." He straightened his shoulders and ascended the gangplank. At the top, he raised a hand in farewell. Sun Wen's deportation lit a fire under his supporters. The men and women of the Tung Mun Hui travelled around Penang and Malaya making speeches and spreading Sun Wen's calls to rise up against the Qing monarchy. I continued to visit the reading club twice a week, working at the long table for an hour or two before slipping off to the House of Doors. This morning, something made me look twice at the entrance doors. I took a step back, tilted my head, and I saw it. Faint lines on the face of the wood, forming an arcane design. The pattern looked familiar. "What is that odd-looking symbol on your front doors?" I asked Arthur later when we were lying in bed. "I asked Pak Musa across the street to carve it last week," he replied. "Somerset Maugham put it on every one of his books. It's a sign to keep away bad luck." Of course. Now I remembered where I had seen it before. "I've always liked it," said Arthur. "I wanted to protect this house." He shaped his palm to my cheek. "Our house." In the dying days of August, an insurrection broke out in Canton. A month later, another uprising erupted. This rebellion caught fire and flared across China. Sun Wen, in America raising money, rushed back to Canton. One afternoon, Arthur and I were sitting by the airwell in the House of Doors, sipping tea and listening to the patter of the falling rain. "We had a meeting last night," Arthur began. 30 members from the KL Tung Mun Hui volunteered to go to China. 20 from Penang. I was one of them. I put down my cup and stared at him. "But how long will you be away?" "Until I'm not needed there." "That could take years. If all of us felt like that, there would be no revolution, no change for the better. Now is the time to act, Leslie." "You're just bloody selfish. With this close to succeeding, sacrifices have to be made. Why is it that when you men make sacrifices, it's always we women who must suffer the most?" We saw each other only one more time before he sailed to Canton. A week later, an item was delivered to the house. A pair of doors. When Robert came home that evening, he told me that the Sultan of Selangor had announced that he would be pardoning Ethel, on condition she leave Malaya and never return. She was given a week to pack her things and leave Malaya with her daughter. I asked her to stay with us on her way to England. She didn't mention the trial until her last day. "What you did for me, Leslie, I'll never forget it. It didn't help much in the end, did it? You didn't betray me. That's what matters most to me." "What's William going to do?" "He'll join you in England." The light emptied from her eyes. "I never want to see him again." "You can't mean that. He stood by your side." "He made me do it, Leslie." Her voice sounded dead. I felt cold all of a sudden. "He made me do it. He made me kill William." "Whatever do you mean? Ethel?" She turned her bracelet on her wrist a few times. Then, with a visible lurch, like a motor car jerking into life, she seemed to come back to herself. "I'm glad we're leaving," she said, smiling at me. And after that, I heard no more of her. One morning in January 1912, I came down to breakfast to find Robert looking oddly at me over the top of his newspaper. "It's President Sun Yat-sen now," he said. The Qing dynasty was dead. The Republic of China had come into being. I put down the paper and stared out to the sea. He had done it. Sun Wen had achieved his dream. I prayed Arthur was safe. Leslie, Penang, 1921. For some time after I stopped talking, Willie remained silent. I got up and went over to the windows. All these nights, telling Willie about my life and my marriage. What had I accomplished? I had expected to feel liberated, unburdened. But in the end I felt only a deep sadness for myself, and, something which I had not expected, for Robert too. Something in the dark scrim of the sea flashed in the corner of my eye. Then again. Fancy a stroll on the beach, Willie? The sea was quiet, the waves listless. We had gone about 50 paces when I pulled up abruptly. Look, in the sea. There was nothing, just dense blackness. Then a patch of blue light flared up in the water, like lightning trapped inside a wall of storm clouds. Goodness, Willie said softly. He was mesmerized, I could tell. You know what's the best thing for a sticky night like this? He caught my meaning instantly. Oh, no. Absolutely not. But I was already unbuttoning my blouse and my skirt. They whispered down the length of my body onto the sand, to be joined a moment later by my undergarments. I stood there naked. I didn't give a flying fig about Willie. Well, he was homosexual, wasn't he? It's pitch black out there, he began. Oh, stop bleating like an old woman, Willie. He took off his clothes, and then, naked except for his trepidation, he followed me into the sea. The water was blood-warm, and I seemed to dissolve into it. We swam out, and all at once we were swimming in cobalt fire, every kick and stroke igniting the tempests of plankton swirling around us. We dunked our heads under the blazing sea and came up again, spluttering fire from our lips. Rivulets of blue flames streamed down Willie's hair, his face. I scooped up handfuls of the sea, marvelling at the fire snakes writhing down my arms. That night, side by side, we drifted among the galaxies of sea stars, while far, far above us, the asterisks of light marked out the footnotes on the page of eternity.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Willie, Penang, 1921. The tide had lured the sea away when Willie went down to the beach. Under the morning sun, the mud flats seemed to stretch all the way to the mainland. He had completed only 3 stories. He would need to write 3 or 4 more when he was back in London. A satisfying collection required 6 stories at least. He looked around the beach and saw Leslie and went over to her. "The last time you spoke to Ethel," Willie said, as they strolled back to the house, "what did she mean when she told you, 'He made me do it, I had no choice, he made me kill William'?" "I haven't a clue, Willie. For a long time I kept trying to understand, but people here were ashamed of her." She shrugged. "I'd like to see the house where Sun plotted his revolution. And the house of doors." The rickshaw dropped them outside the squat grey-stone building of the Chartered Bank, and Leslie led them into the Asiatic quarter. Itinerant vendors shouted out their wares, piling onto the din of motors and buses and rickshaws. Leslie halted at a shop-house. "The Tong Mung Hui's base," she said. Above the lintel hung a rectangular blackwood signboard carved with a pair of Chinese ideograms covered in gold leaf. So this is where you used to come. Twice a week. You played a role in Sun Wen's revolution too. You're part of the history of China. A tiny, insignificant role, long forgotten already. They followed the street to the last shop-house. The expectant look on her face told him that they were standing outside the House of Doors. Have you been inside since Arthur left? No, but you have the key. I will only enter the house again when he comes home. She beckoned him forward, and then he saw it. Embossed on the door's surface was a network of lines, each one about an inch wide, no deeper than the thickness of a leaf. How strange to come upon his own symbol here. Does it work for you? Leslie traced the lines of the Hamsa with her fingers. I've escaped death many times. As they walked away from the House of Doors, he and Leslie, by some silent agreement, both turned back at the same time to take one last look.
Leslie, Penang, 1921. On the night before Willie's departure, I lay in my bed listening to the sea. For the first time in many years, I felt a sharp, painful longing for Arthur. 11 years of silence lay between us. He had kept his word. No messages, no letters. I had been devastated with grief when he went to China to join the revolution, but, if I were to be honest, a part of me was also relieved. We had achieved the impossible. We had kept our affair a secret. And yet sometimes it grieved me that no one would ever know the joy he had given me, and the sorrow I had had to conceal when I lost him. He had given me the strength to remain in my marriage, to endure it. I put on my dressing gown and went downstairs to the veranda. The night was still, lying at anchor. Willie was leaning against the balustrade, smoking a cigarette. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" I said. I could never sleep the night before a journey. I thought about Robert and me, and about Robert and Peter Ong. I thought about Arthur and myself, and I thought about Willie and Gerald. "We fell in love with the wrong person," I said. "You and Gerald, Robert and Peter Ong, Arthur and myself." "I did not fall in love with the wrong person, my dear Leslie. I only made the mistake of marrying the wrong one." "How cynical, Willie." "What you've told me, your affair with Arthur, it will ruin your marriage if I were to write about it." "That's never stayed your pen before, has it?" "Is that what you want? To blow your marriage to smithereens?" "I'm tired of the silence between us, Willie. So very tired." "What about Robert's affair?" "You must have heard stories like that over the years. Yet you have never written about a homosexual affair in any of your books." I looked at him. "And I think you never will. Why risk drawing the beam of that particular light onto yourself?" His fingers tapped on the balustrade. "And Arthur's marriage? Do you have the right to destroy that?" "My dear Mr. Morm, surely you didn't actually think I would have used his real name?" Willie shook his head. "You've thought everything through, haven't you?" "I made a decision. When Robert moves to the Karoo, I will be going with him." He nodded, but said nothing. In his eyes I saw understanding and pity. "The boys are going to have such a shock when they hear Africa's their new home." "All boys want to go to Africa." "Did you?" "I wasn't like other boys, Leslie." "No, you were not." I reached over and gave him the lightest kiss on his cheek. Leslie, Doornfontein, South Africa, 1947. The sun is retreating behind the mountains when I go out onto the stoop. I sit in my wicker chair and pour myself a glass of red wine. And then, as I have done every evening since Robert died, I fill his glass as well and set it on the table between us. "I received a book today, Robert," I say to the empty chair. "One of Willie's old books, The Casuarina Tree." Willie had visited Malaya again 3 years after he had first travelled there. The Casuarina Tree, the book he had published after his stay with us, had made him more famous than ever. But the people in the Straits settlements were furious with the stories he had written about them. He had betrayed their trust. Robert had bought a copy, read it, and passed it to me, not saying a word. I opened it with more than a little trepidation. After I turned the last page of the final story, the letter, I marvelled at Willie's ingenuity and the leaps of imagination he had taken with Ethel's tale. He had woven it into something that was familiar to me, yet also uncanny, factual, but at the same time completely fictional. "Rather impertinent of Willie to put us in his stories, don't you think?" Robert said that evening. "Well, he's your friend, Robert." Willie had not written about Sun Wen, and there was nothing about my affair with Arthur. "We got off lightly, I suppose," said Robert. Reading the letter had brought back to me Ethel's strange remark on that balmy afternoon before she left Malaya forever. Robert slowly turned his head towards me. "She said that to you?" "He made me do it." He took a sip of Parhead. "What I'm about to tell you, Leslie, must remain strictly between us." He put his drink down and began to tell me a story. While Ethel was in jail, awaiting the Sultan's pardon, certain facts came to light which indicated that William Stewart's death was premeditated. William Proudlock found out about Ethel and Stewart when he came home from Hong Kong. He began to blackmail Stewart. Stewart, afraid that he would be publicly shamed for being involved with a married woman, gave him the money at first, but then changed his mind. If Proudlock did not give him back his money, everyone would know his wife had slept with him. "What did William do?" I asked. "He consulted a lawyer. He wanted to know what the legal consequences were if a woman were to shoot a man who was trying to rape her." "If she were to kill him?" Robert nodded. William told Ethel what he wanted her to do. He also warned her that he would divorce her if she refused. He even approached her father with his plan. So you see, Leslie, she had nowhere to go, and no one to turn to. After all these years, I finally understood the reason for Ethel's loathing of her husband. Was anything done about it? Nothing could be done, unless Ethel confessed to what she'd been forced to do. "Poor Ethel," I said. "They forced her, her husband and her own father." In the winter of 1938, 16 years after we had moved to Doornfontein, Robert suffered a heart attack. I buried him in the family cemetery. I continued to live in Doornfontein, far from the world beyond the mountains. My sons grew up, became men in England. Another war came. James was posted to Malaya. He died there, in the land where he was born. Night has fallen, and the chill is stealing into my bones. Willie Moore must be in his 70s now, living in his new home in Cap Ferrat. I open the copy of The Casuarina Tree I received this morning. and begin to read it again. My eyes returned to Willie's symbol on the page. With my forefinger, I traced the additional lines that had been inked in by a later hand. They framed the symbol in a rectangle, the line in the middle cleaving it in half, dividing it into the twin panels of the front doors guarding a house with many more doors within it, each one of them turning slowly in the air, turning like the silent cogs of some great mechanical clock. It is almost 40 years since I last saw Arthur. He has kept his word, even after all this time. No letters, no notes. Instead, he has sent me this message in a book, a message that only I could decipher. Pressing my finger on the Hamza, I think about the past, my past, but most of all, I think about new stories that have not been written yet. I go out into the garden. The night is vast and still. For a long time I stand there in that great hall of the Temple of Stars. There are many tasks to do in the coming days, travel arrangements to make, things to hold on to, and things to let go of. But first there is a letter I must write and send. A letter to Arthur, waiting for me in the House of Doors.